Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. And today we bring you our fourth of 4 episodes in our Race and the Media series, brought to you by the South African Media Innovation Program. For more on the excellent work they do in funding media startups, check the link in the description below. And today, through their wisdom and a little bit of mine, I bring you a guest that I've been wishing to have on this platform for many a long month. And that is a media titan, former editor of the Mail and Guardian when she was still able to be a member of the Youth League, and founder of the Daily Vox, someone with vast and deep experience in the South African media landscape, Khadija Patel. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to SMWX.
Wa alaikum salam, and thanks for having me, Sizwe. I was wondering whether you had something against me. Is this why it's taken this long for me to be on?
It's all about the timing, all about the timing.
Okay.
Well, I have to say that there are many amazing things about you, but preeminent among them is that you're a Liverpool fan. And, you know, this is one of your many virtues.
As a virtue recognizes virtue. So yeah, absolutely.
By the time we release this episode, we will have beaten Everton over the weekend, you know,
exactly.
well on our way to...
that 7-2 defeat would be long gone.
Yeah.
Who would even remember that?
I don't even speak about... I don't even know if that really happened. How did you get into supporting Liverpool, by the way?
So my family, my parents are huge sports fans. So I grew up in a home where the TV was either on Sky News, you know, when DSTV first started. So, 20 past the hour on Sky News, there's sports news. And my dad only had Sky News on because he was waiting for the sports news. I enjoyed the rest of the news. But both my parents are huge sports fans. And really, I the way some people get into art or through their parents or a film. In my home, it was sport. So whether it was golf, tennis, cricket, rugby, football, there's always sport on the TV over here. So yeah, so it's. So this is very much a Liverpool house.
Love it. Yeah, my mom and I always, before COVID, we would always make a ritual of trying to catch the Liverpool game. But anyway, we could probably go on for the whole day about Liverpool.
Certainly.
Khadija, so this series is about race in the media. And I think the issues are well known, but media practitioners' experiences aren't as well known. Sometimes they're known within journalistic circles, but the public often doesn't know what journalists go through, particularly Black journalists, women journalists. And so I wanted to start by just asking you to think through some of your experiences in the media landscape. And, when did you realize that race was an important factor in the way that journalism is practiced in South Africa? And what are some of your experiences of race's salience in the South African media?
Sizwe, I think that I was first, and most Black journalists have this moment, like that awakening moment to their realities. That's true for most corporate spaces, social spaces. There's this moment where you actually realize that actually, no, everyone here is not your friend. And those that may actually, you think that they're your friends, actually have deep-seated prejudices. And that, it's very difficult to work, through that at first. I was working, at the Daily Maverick, from 2011. And I mean, I covered many stories with the DM team. I was part of the award-winning Marikana team. I mean, the DM was the first publication to break the news of the fact that there was a second killing site in Marikana, right? So yes, there were so many, really important stories that that I was part of, and I was young, and I had a lot of freedom at the Daily Maverick as a young journalist, which was wonderful, right? Because also I don't have formal journalistic training. My undergrad is in languages and literature. My postgrad is in social linguistics. I didn't come to journalism through traditional means or ways or avenues, and I think that in the course of doing your work, in the course of working with colleagues as well, you then do become more aware of the fact that people have prejudices. And this particularly comes to light, when in the way we tackle certain stories, right? When we make mistakes as an organization, no organization, no media organization is above making mistakes. We are human, and thus we are fallible, and sometimes we're going to make mistakes. But I always say that the mark of good journalists is how they respond to those mistakes. And sometimes, and it was in the course of, of those kinds of experiences, that, you sit in an editorial meeting as a young journalist and you realize that, but there is more than one narrative of this country. And we appear to have a single narrative. And yet, you look around and young Black journalists don't necessarily feel empowered, at least at that time, to actually speak up and speak against, what is happening or what they think. And this really was, that for me was very, very important, because it's something that I not only witnessed in my own experience, that I also saw happening across the industry. A lot of young Black journalists were burning out, actually ending up in PR, because, journalism it's a tough job on any day. But when you also, when you don't feel like you can be your true self and your whole self in a certain space, it's exhausting and it's dehumanizing, frankly. So yeah, so that, so Sizwe, that experience of mine is actually what birthed the Daily Vox for me, because in the course of this experience, I remember being invited to WITS to guest lecture a media studies class. And it was at a point where, I was really feeling really disenchanted with journalism and, and the spaces that I was in. And I was feeling very restless. And I go to this class and I tell them, because they want to know what life is like for a journalist, a young journalist in South Africa. And I tell them that what I want, those of them who, who harbor ambitions to join newsrooms, to be journalists, I want them to feel empowered enough to raise their voices and to challenge the status quo, and, to demand more narratives to exist of South Africa. And I thought that I had, given a very impassioned plea to this young, impressionable audience. The lecture hall was full. It was an early morning. And one young woman, it's time for Q&A, and one young woman put up her hand and she said, I get you, I hear you. This is what we need to do. But I want to know, what are you doing right now to make it easier for us when we get there? And I was taken aback by that question, because I had ceded any sense of agency, I think, in those spaces, that up until that moment, I didn't think that I could actually do something or say something. That young woman ended up being Ponso Pilani. And that's how...
From episode 1 of this series.
Yes. And that's how I met Ponso and eventually hired her.
Oh, wow.
And the rest, as they say, is history.
As you say that, I wanted to just take you up on what you said there, because it gets me to understand this from a particular perspective, which is that you are fighting in many ways a dual battle when you're a Black person, a woman in a newsroom. On the one hand, you are pushing for, or thinking about at least pushing for change within your newsroom and your organization on the one hand. But then on the other hand, you're also trying to like fight with very important figures and you know, bring the truth out, surface the truth. And maybe for, you know, white journalists who happen to be, you know, predominant, let's say, in a certain organization, they don't have that like multiple battleground feeling. You know, they come in, they do their work, they feel comfortable, and they hold people to power to account.
And they go home, and that's it.
Mm.
You know, I keep saying that in my next life, I want to come back as a white woman, because I don't have that. You know, I go home and I shut the door, and you know, there's no other responsibilities. Nobody needs anything else of you. But the truth is that for Black people, it's very, very different. And it's exactly that. You know, your role as a journalist is not your work is not just what you're producing or what somebody is reading or watching or listening to what you produce. Your work is amplified for yourself within the space that you're working, because you're working to transform an organization, and it's difficult. And as a young person, that can actually be career suicide often, right? Because you're too loud, or you know, too too questioning, and you're a problem, right? You should be grateful for the position that you have. I'm happy to say, Sizwe, that I think that a lot of that has changed. I think that the space is a lot more open now than it was, let's say, maybe 10 years ago. I think that young Black journalists coming into newsrooms have a lot more freedom to just be themselves. But it's still difficult, because there are prejudices that continue to exist. I'll give you an example. When I have this other problem where I'm a visibly Muslim woman, right? And the problem is that often the only thing people see when I walk into a room is my headscarf. It's you know, my entire identity, anything I'm saying, just amounts to this piece of clothing, right? So people automatically assume that I am not that smart, and then when I actually speak, and they're like, "Wow, you speak so well," and you know, and it's insulting in that same way that it's always insulting when it's said to a Black person. But it's particularly insulting because I know it's like somebody patting me on my back saying, "Oh, despite this thing, you're okay in there, hey?" I mean, when my appointment at the Mail and Guardian was announced, I was interviewed by a radio host on regional talk radio station. And I mean, it was in the midst of an overwhelming, you know, swirl of events that had happened. Suddenly, you know, I was thrust into this position that I had not, you know, sought, and you know, but it was amazing, and yet so overwhelming. And so the announcement of my appointment goes out, and you know, I'm doing media interviews. This particular host asks me, "So I'm a little worried." He says, "Will you be able to respond properly to Gwede Mantashe when he calls at 11 o'clock to shout at you about one of your journalists?" And so at that time, Gwede Mantashe was the SG of the ANC. And I was again, I mean, I was so shocked by that question that, I mean, I to this day, I remember the question very well. I can't remember my answer, right? I can tell you that I've responded many ways with many swear words in my head following that. But just that one question told me so much about what this person, and this is a person who knew me, who'd worked with me, what they thought of who an editor should be, right? Or the kind of body an editor should inhabit. That, unfortunately, is a battle we continue to wage, you know, to show that we belong without question. And this is why, you know, the debate around merit and transformation for me is it's a tired one, because there's just so much that still has to be transformed, and we have to be honest about that. Well, we have not done enough. We've done some good things. We certainly, like I said, I think the media looks very different now than it did 10 years ago, and that's, it's not by accident, right? But there's still a lot of work to do. There's still there still has to be a lot more work to be done in, for example, media management.
So on that, by the way, when you made your earlier point, I was thinking of the article that you wrote on assuming the editorship of the Mail and Guardian in November 2016, where you said, and I quote, "For some, ascending the ranks to one of the most prized positions in journalism in Africa is a rite of passage. It's never questioned. It's the order of the universe. It's the way things are done. I, however, am not supposed to be here. I'm certainly not supposed to have arrived here with such apparent haste, and I'm not supposed to look so different." And it just made me think about what it means when you are asked to be the editor of a major publication in South Africa as a Muslim woman or a Black man or someone who's not a white man or maybe even a white woman. I don't think we know what that feels like. I don't think we've sat back and thought, we're all about putting pressure on you and telling you what we think you should do. But does a young aspiring editor know what it's like to be in that hot seat and feel all the different things that are coming at you when you are actually given that opportunity?
I didn't know what I was in for, to be honest. Suddenly I had flowers arriving from the CEO of FNB, and I was like,
oh my.
The other day I was, just an ordinary person. Now suddenly, the country's top executives are sending me flowers, and it's a whole other universe, Sizwe. And I'm grateful to have entered that universe in a place like the Mail and Guardian. The Mail and Guardian newsroom is a fantastic newsroom. It has a very democratic spirit, and that's part of its genesis. And it's very, very self-aware. So, I'm grateful, to have had that experience. Even though I can tell you that even within the newsroom, there's still issues, right? I mean, sure. When I arrived there was, one of my first briefings was with the HR manager was like, "You have a huge racism problem to deal with." And I was like, "Sorry, what?" And then she takes out, wow. Kind of like a ganogram, and it's like, "I think this one's racist. I think that one's racist." And I was like, "Oh dear goodness." Right?
That's crazy.
And this is on top of, first of all, trying to keep a good newsroom afloat in very challenging financial conditions, trying to keep the integrity of your work up when there is an organized campaign against the work of journalism, and and still wanting to do good, solid work. There is a lot, there's a lot of pressure in any given moment in the life of an editor, particularly so for a young Black editor, because we don't have room to be mediocre. You have to be excellent. There is no one's giving you space. You're judged from the minute you get there, and you're expected to shine right through. There's you cannot possibly be mediocre, and so there's the thing about South Africa, in these last few years is that we are having so many challenging conversations about race and culture and gender. And this is particularly important when we have these conversations in newsrooms, because this is a space in which we are putting a mirror back into society. right? So when we are having an argument in the newsroom over whether we should italicize, other indigenous languages in the paper, and what it means when we are treating isiZulu, an isiZulu word in the paper as a foreign language, those kinds of conversations are the ones that are important, because they may sound trivial in the bigger story, but those are the kind of questions that are important in instilling a newsroom culture. It's important in ensuring that the people who are in that newsroom, when you're bringing young Black people, that they feel at ease, and that they feel able to bring their whole self to work. And so that's important. Like I said, there's still, and just thinking about it now, you point out that, that piece that I wrote was in November of 2016. So in December of that year, it's just, I was at the MNG formally for maybe about 2 or 3 months or so. We put the last edition of the paper to bed. It was a lovely summer afternoon. It was, a nice sense of accomplishment. We, just having a nice chat. I then went into my office to see to some admin. My deputy joined me a little bit later. He was sitting and chatting to me, and somebody else walked into the newsroom. There was a bottle of champagne that had been popped. It was a celebration. We'd seen the year out, and this person brought 2 flutes of champagne to the office, gave one to my deputy, and then gestured to give me one, and I politely declined. And so my deputy looked at this person and said, "But isn't it rude for you to give Khadija, offer her alcohol when you know she's a Muslim?" And this person said, "Well, she's breaking so many rules by just being here, so I figured, what's one more?" And it's those kinds of remarks, especially early on, that told me a lot about how even a very liberal space encounters difference.
And sometimes that can be the worst, right? Because the liberal spaces are the spaces where people assume that they have no blind spots.
Yes. And that's, the hardest conversations we had in the Mail and Guardian. So we had this ritual where on a Friday we had something called a review. So at 10 o'clock on a Friday, basically we discuss, what we'd done well for the week, what we fell short on, and it was really just an open floor for people to air, their thoughts, their experiences, for us to discuss media ethics issues, bitch a little bit about the suits, all healthy things. And often those conversations, became sites of us questioning why we do things the way we do. Why was, a certain image used in this way? What it says about Black people that we used this word and not that, and for the older white liberal generation who had no question of their politics before this, right? Because it was easy to be on, I keep saying it was easy to be on the good side in the apartheid days. You were either for it or against it, and if you were if you were not against it, then you were just not a nice person. So, that questioning, the fact that just because you were a radical in 1985, does not mean that, your politics have stayed radical in 2016, 17, 18, or whatever it is. And yes, and I guess that's a reflection of what's happening elsewhere in South Africa, and not just in newsrooms. But they're very, very difficult to have those conversations. There's sometimes, that I wondered whether we do it too much. surely, it's not our responsibility to educate people to be decent human beings. But again, this is South Africa at a particular moment in time, and we are creating a product that we hope does many things at the same time, but importantly communicates with people. And for that, we have to be very, very introspective, I think, about
Absolutely.
what we do and how we do it. Yeah.
Wow, I have so many things to ask you. Well, let me start with one, which is, you're a South African of Indian descent, and that adds a new dimension to some of the conversations we've had in this series, because obviously you're on the receiving end of racism. You have various other parts of your identity that matter to you, and there are intersections there as well. But it's a different experience from other Black South Africans in newsrooms.
Yeah.
I was reading some academic literature about the experiences of Indian women in newsrooms. What kinds of experiences did you go through, and what did you think that your perspective enabled you to see as an Indian woman in a newsroom, in one of the most important publications, and also as a founder of the Daily Vox?
Yeah, Sizwe, the thing that I just thought about right now, I got to the MNG at a point where, kind of like the waning years of the Gupta era. Thuli Madonsela's state capture report happened, I think, it was my first edition. My first edition at the MNG coincided with the release of Thuli Madonsela's report, right? It feels like 10 years ago.
Tell me about it.
And there was this rumor going around, right, that I only caught wind of much later, maybe even close to a year after I had gotten to the MNG, that I was actually a Gupta stooge. That I was actually on SalimEssa's payroll. The Guptas had strategically placed me at the MNG to thwart negative coverage of them. So that is so ridiculous. First of all, I want to know, Salim, you've been late on my checks all these years, if I have indeed been on your payroll. But more seriously, the only thing that could point people to the fact or the possibility that I was a Gupta stooge was my ethnicity. Really
absolutely.
offensive. It is really, really offensive. And I think, a lot of the kind of social media harassment that I received through the years has been, sort of like in that vein of, go back to India. Where's the Guptas now? The Guptas are gone. Go back with them. Right. So that, for me, that was my experience. And I can't speak for the totality of Indian women's experiences in newsrooms, but it is, it's weird. It's just weird, and it's maddening. I can tell you, Sizwe, when I caught wind of that rumor, I was so angry. I was just so angry, because how dare people, concoct such an elaborate story, based on what? On what? It's just maddening. Even now, when I think about it, it's what the hell, man, guys? What the hell? It's just not cool. It's not, and it's dehumanizing.
I just can't with that. But it's also so fascinating to see the different ways that racism works depending on your perspective and your identity, and to realize that racism within the media and as received by journalists is multifaceted, and there are various forms which affect people differently.
Exactly, and this is why we can't talk about racism in the media without talking about racism as a social construct outside of the media, right? And then how that social construct depends on the media to continue.
Yeah.
So so there's for me, I know, there's so many people who say, oh no, not another conversation about race. Sizwe, I'll tell you that for at least a year while I was at M&G, the fantastic Melissa Tando Bongela was my arts editor.
Yes.
Millie is amazing. She is amazing. And she's always, she's always asking hard questions with her work, right? And she's fantastic at that. And I remember one edition, there was actually, like a social media meme going on that week where Black people were talking about the first time they realized that racism exists, right? And people were sharing their experiences, often as children, when they realized, or their first experience of racism, so to speak. Yeah. So Millie did this fantastic thing where she did, so Friday, which is the arts and culture, package of the Mail and Guardian. So the cover, because it's a pullout, or it was at that time. So the cover, so both the front and the back page, she basically republished with a stark black background and white text with these little snippets of people's experiences of when they actually experienced racism for the first time, or understood racism exists. It was a very, very powerful illustration of the moment. And I remember that Friday when the paper was published, I'd gone over to have an EXCO meeting, so that's with the other heads of department, outside of editorial as well. And the head of commercial was a white woman at the time. She came to me with the Friday in her hand, and she said to me, "What is this?" And I said, "It's this week's edition of Friday." Why? And she said, "Why are we publishing things about racism?" And I was like, "Oh, first of all, who are you to ask me? I'm the editor. But what do you mean?" And she basically said, "It's absolutely disgusting that we are falling into this trap of, of talking about racism as if it's the most important thing in South Africa." And I was so taken aback by that, right? That I could only walk out of there without screaming or shouting or really losing my dignity in that moment. It was still early days, Sizwe, let me tell you this. They'll tell you, if you ask people at the M&G, in the coming years, I thought nothing of screaming, shouting, swearing, and throwing things at people. I've done it before. Right. But this is the reason I'm putting this, and I'm making a point of this, Sizwe, is that when we talk about racism in the media, we're often only talking about it from a newsroom point of view. But most newsrooms in South Africa still count on advertising to pay most of its bills.
Right.
Right. And if the advertising agencies are also not having a transformation moment, and are also not, having these same conversations, and also able to relate them to how publications are transforming themselves.
For goodness sake, they should be thinking like, are we going to give these advertising brands to companies that aren't serious about transformation?
Thank you. And but my experience of often going to these agency meetings is there's no awareness of this as an issue at all.
That's such an interesting, because people wouldn't think like transformation, the media, advertising. We know they're linked, but we don't see how they link on the question of race and discrimination.
And for me, this is an important, it's an important milestone that we are yet to reach. Most, in my experience of people in ad sales, they have no clue about, social dynamics, and are not likely to be able to make decisions based on, on race or gender, or, or really on issues, that that are a measure of transformation in any sense. And this, for me, this is a problem, because this is predominantly the, it's a capitalist society, unfortunately. When the capital does not transform itself, we're not going anywhere.
Well, Khadija, it's been an honor to have you on SMWX. You have dropped bombshell after bombshell, and it's been so fascinating just to go behind the scenes of what it's like to be in, some of the positions that you've been in, and just to learn more about the landscape and how it affects the wider country and how the wider country affects it. So on behalf of the entire audience, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Thank you for having me.
And to many more Liverpool titles.
Indeed.
Ayeye.